I would determine that what is happening at the moment in Gaza constitutes genocide. In genocide studies, we refer to genocide as a process, not an event. And that means that we don't look at just one thing. We look at many months or even many years of actions that have been taking place. It is certain that we can say that there are war crimes and also crimes against humanity taking place in Gaza on a daily basis. You cannot argue we are defending ourselves by committing genocide. That is simply not an option under international law. I am Dr. Melanie O'Brien. I am an Associate Professor of International Law at the University of Western Australia Law School, and I am also the Deputy Head of School in the law school. I am the President of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, which is an international association with more than 700 members worldwide. The legal perspective is what is mostly relevant and important at the moment. In a situation that's ongoing, and when we're talking about whether or not the international community, whether international organizations should take action, what they will be looking at is the legal definition. In applying international law as it exists today, that is the definition of genocide that we find in the Genocide Convention and we find in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, I would determine that what is happening at the moment in Gaza constitutes genocide. That definition is a list of crimes committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a group of people, either national, racial, ethnic, or religious. And those crimes include crimes of killing or imposing conditions designed to bring about the physical destruction of life. And at the moment, what we can see going on fits well within that legal definition of genocide. In genocide studies, we refer to genocide as a process, not an event. And that means that we don't look at just one thing. We look at many months or even many years of actions that have been taking place. And when we're talking about Gaza today and whether or not genocide is taking place today, we are therefore not just talking about what happens today or what has even happened in the last 2 months or even the last 18 months. We are also looking at what has happened in the past. Prior to the 7th of October, we are looking at a long history of persecution and discrimination, of apartheid, and of regular conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. So this is in the context of all of that, many years of history of that. First of all, we need to look at the idea of intent that comes with the definition of genocide, this what we call a special intent, and that is the intent to destroy the group. And that is one of the hardest things to prove in a courtroom, and why people often ask about, how do we prove that? So how do we prove that special intent in a courtroom? One of the most obvious ways is through direct statements made by political and military leaders or other prominent members in a community, and we do see that here. We have seen that since very early on, immediately after the 7th of October. Statements made by Israeli political and military leadership concerning the destruction of Palestine, the destruction of the Palestinian people, the starvation of the Palestinian people. So very overt statements of intent. We can also prove that intent through looking at a pattern of conduct. And so what we do is we take that pattern, not just from the 8th of October, but from prior to that, for the many years before that, and we look at what has been going on. But if we think about what we would look at since the 7th of October, we would be talking about mass casualties, huge numbers of deaths, tens of thousands of deaths committed through indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, injuries, so causing serious bodily or mental harm. But even going beyond that, we're looking at the destruction of healthcare facilities. So Palestinians in Gaza cannot access healthcare. We are looking at the destruction of essential infrastructure like electricity and water plants. So people in Palestine have no power, they cannot access water. We are looking at the restriction on humanitarian aid, which in this case covers food, water, and healthcare, things like medicines. So without access to this is what we would say is the genocidal crime of imposing conditions of life designed to bring about physical destruction. Because if you are denying people water, shelter, healthcare, and food, the outcome is inevitable, and we've seen that in past genocides. This kind of conduct is actually essential to the genocide process, in particular the denial of food and water. And what it creates is an obvious situation. What else are you trying to do if you deny people food other than starve them to death? So we're seeing starvation, malnutrition, people affected by denial of water, so thirst. But also what this creates is a situation where you have a spread of illnesses and disease, and with the destruction of the healthcare system in Gaza and the denial of healthcare and medicines being allowed into Gaza, then people who have these diseases obviously have no means of recovering from them. They also have no means of recovering from injuries that, if they had access to a functional hospital, they may survive, but in the context are likely not to. So what we're seeing is not only starvation, but also death from illnesses. And in the circumstances that they're in, where we're talking about many people in very close conditions, particularly in refugee camp style areas, then we're looking at communicable diseases that spread very fast. Diseases like cholera, which in these conditions can be deadly for many, many people. So when we're talking about what are the elements here that prove genocide, we're talking about statements of intent from Israeli political and military leadership. We're talking about indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas resulting in tens of thousands of deaths and the destruction of civilian infrastructure, buildings, residential areas, taking away shelter that people have, the destruction of healthcare, the entire healthcare system, and attacks on healthcare workers, denying healthcare and medicines to people in Gaza. We're talking about the destruction of essential infrastructure such as electricity and water plants, the denial of water, and we're talking about the denial of humanitarian aid into the region, meaning no food for the people in there, which is leading to malnutrition and starvation and the spread of communicable diseases. It's really important to remember that we are talking about a situation of armed conflict. The Israeli Defense Force is using international humanitarian law as one justification for its actions, in the sense that they're arguing that they have a right to self-defense against the armed attack that Hamas carried out on the 7th of October. However, it's not that straightforward, because there are rules under international humanitarian law that military attacks must take place firstly only on military objectives, but also must be necessary. So this concept of military necessity, is this absolutely necessary to carry out? But also there has to be a specific military objective as part of that. The attacks also have to be proportionate to the threat that the state was receiving. But what's important to remember is that many of these do not apply. If we think about the horrific events of the 7th of October, we now have 18 months or more of indiscriminate bombing, which in itself is unlawful, and that has resulted in tens of thousands of deaths of Palestinian persons, which is certainly disproportionate to what took place on the 7th of October. In terms of thinking about the concept of self-defense, yes, that exists in international law as a genuine and legal argument that can be made for the use of force. However, there is no excuse or no justification for committing genocide. So you cannot argue we are defending ourselves by committing genocide. That is simply not an option under international law. And we also have to remember that when they are conducting themselves in the conflict in Gaza, they should be complying with international humanitarian law, the laws of war at every step, and that is certainly not taking place. There are many violations of the laws of war. For example, the attacking of healthcare facilities and healthcare workers, which are protected under the laws of war, the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, and attacking specifically refugee camps. And we also know as well, for example, that many journalists have been targeted and killed in this, and they are also protected under international humanitarian law. There are many, many other issues that we have seen, for example, the arbitrary detention and torture of Palestinians. So there are many, many laws of war that are at play here, and many of which are being violated on a daily basis. When we're talking about whether or not an atrocity situation is genocide, in one sense, it doesn't matter. If you are looking at a situation like this where we can definitively say that there are war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed possibly on a daily basis, then there are already horrific crimes being committed. But from a legal perspective, determining that there is a risk of genocide or that genocide is taking place does make a difference. And one of the reasons is because we have a Genocide Convention. This was drafted after World War II as a response to the Holocaust. And the Genocide Convention obligates states who are party to that convention to prohibit and to punish genocide. And that obligation is triggered when there is a serious risk of genocide. So even before genocide is at a full-blown stage, when it's in the risk stage, that is already an obligation on states to act. And so this is why it's legally important, because whether or not the Genocide Convention is triggered matters, because it matters to the other states who are outside of it and whether or not they have obligations. We do not have a Crimes Against Humanity treaty that is about to be under negotiation over the next few years, but we don't have one at the moment. In terms of determining whether genocide has taken place, essentially, if genocide has happened, it has happened, regardless of whether anyone calls it that or not. But there are many people who can talk about and make an assessment. So those of us who are genocide scholars, we are experts in that area. We've studied genocide for a long time. And my perspective as an international lawyer is to apply the law to the facts on the ground to determine that. So that's the discussion that scholars as experts in the field can have. We can also have politicians can engage in the debate. And that is quite important. We can see from past genocides that recognition of genocide is a really important factor coming from politicians, either individually or parliaments as recognizing genocide. And of course, at the moment, however, when we're talking about an ongoing genocide, politicians may be reluctant to do that because if their country is a party to the Genocide Convention, that acknowledgement would trigger obligations on the part of that state. We also have courts, of course, who can make a determination. So that might be, for example, the International Court of Justice, which, as we know at the moment, South Africa has brought a case against Israel for what is happening in Gaza before the International Court of Justice. And so that court will eventually, in a few years' time, when it gets to the merit stage of the case, it will make a determination as to whether or not Israel has breached its obligation to prevent and punish and incite genocide. Another possible court could be the International Criminal Court. It is also investigating what is happening in Gaza, in Palestine more broadly, and has already issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant. Those arrest warrants do not include charges of genocide, but that does not mean charges of genocide cannot be added at a later point. And finally, of course, domestic courts. That should be our first port of call for accountability within a country, but we just don't normally see a country bringing those cases against their own personnel for crimes, international crimes like genocide. So there are many, many different sources of people, scholars who are experts, policymakers, politicians, governments, courts at domestic and international level who can make determinations of genocide and whether or not that is happening on the ground.